This evening, I'd like to start with a question we maybe don't ask enough. And it's one that we can also, I think, ask too much. And so it's sort of a in-between question, but it's this. What does God want from me? I think we can ask this too much in the sense that sometimes we make a mistake of turning our relationship with God into a transaction. We say, what can I do for God, and what can God do for me? And so there's this exchange of goods and services, basically. We have this consumer view of our relationship with God, and so we approach God with a side of, what does God want me to do? And therefore, from that, what can I get out of God? So maybe we can think about this too much, but I think we also think about this far too little when we neglect to concern ourselves with what God asks of us. Or when we do that, sometimes we approach God's requirements for us in our own way, in the sense that we want, that God asks something from us, but we want to meet Him on our own terms. We often approach God with this mindset of selfishness, of what can I get out of God, and then if I am going to give God anything, I want it to be what I want it to be. I don't want to give God what He asks of me, but I want to give Him what I think He deserves, what I think is fair for what He's giving me. And so we have this mindset that focuses on ourselves when we think about our God. Sometimes we try to bargain. We accept that we need to make changes, but we think, I'm going to attend more meetings with the church family and make those relationships and work with the body. But twice a week is enough. Anything else is too much. That's all I need to do. I'm good there. We say, I need to pray more, but 2 times a day, that's quite a lot. That's just fine. And we say, okay, well, God will give me what I want, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be perfectly even in our relationship. It's going to be everything that I need to be giving God. He's going to be giving me everything I need. And we have this mindset where we can either bargain with God, or we can define our own terms for what we can do for Him as we look for what He can do for us. So with that thought in mind, this idea of a selfish attitude and how we approach God, an idea of maybe pride in that as well, that we look at ourselves and say, I know what God wants better than what He wants, or better than He knows what He wants, or that we try to define what is right, and we have this prideful attitude, selfish attitude. With that thought in mind, I would like us all to turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapper 5, we're going to be spending all of our time tonight in a passage that I think many of us know very well. If we have much knowledge of the Old Testament, especially the prophets, I think this is a section, a passage of Scripture that we know, a story that we know. But I think this is an example to us of people who had a very backwards, twisted attitude towards the relationship with God and what perhaps they can get out of God. Of course, what we're talking about tonight begins in verse 1 and goes through verse 19 of 2 Kings 5, and it is the story of Naaman the Syrian. So if you read with me the first 6 verses, we'll set up the stage for what's going to happen here. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but of valor. Now the Syrians had gone out on raids, and brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with a prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus of the girl who is from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised when this letter comes to you, that I send Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And so we open here this story on Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria. A big guy, an important guy. The Bible calls him great and honorable. But he's important. He's powerful. He's leading an army of one of the most powerful nations in the area at this time. This is during the time of the split kingdom of Israel and Judah before Israel had been taken off into captivity. So Syria and Israel were always butting heads, raiding each other, taking each other captive, before eventually the Assyrians took the Israelites away. But here we have Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, who brought great success as the leader of the army, who had found favor in the sight of his master. So he's an important guy. He's a big guy. He's rich, most likely powerful, but he has leprosy. And when we think about leprosy, I assume many of us have heard the lessons talking about leprosy and how terrible it was. That fingers would rot off, and you have these terrible affliction, and often it's fatal because your body just kind of like rotted as you were alive and fell apart. And that's not necessarily the case here. The word for leprosy that we use today refers to a disease called Hansen's disease, which is a very specific illness. But the leprosy referred to in the Bible, in the Levitical law, was just like a disease, usually someone that was like made you ceremonially unclean. And so it was bad, but not necessarily fatal, not necessarily that terrible. But clearly, it was pretty bad here. This guy, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, a great, powerful man, was able to fulfill his duties, though he had this disease. So it clearly wasn't debilitating. But it was bad enough that he went on the word of a captive child. He took the word of this girl captured from Israel, who was probably of questionable trustworthiness because he's just a servant who came from the land of their enemies. But he took this girl's word, he went to his king, and his king sent him to their enemies to get help, which means that he was clearly suffering pretty badly, or at least in need of a cure. He was desperate enough to trust his servant and to go to his king with this, and then to go to his enemies and put them in his hands and say, look, I know you can heal me. And he looked for healing among those who, in many other cases, might have just killed him instead, because he was their enemy brought to them in need, right? So why don't you just kill him? But he's clearly in rough shape, clearly in need of a cure from his illness. He goes to such lengths, depending on where he was in Syria, it could have been several days, maybe just a short trip to the king of Israel, most likely several days, maybe weeks to get here. And so he went to this great length, and great distances and great effort to secure a cure for himself. Because for all his power and all his skill and all his abilities, he couldn't find the cure himself, and he could not find it among his own people. And so he got this letter, and he comes to Israel, the king of Israel, who was Jehoram at the time, with this letter to get healed. And then in verses 7 through 8, we see what happens and how he ends up in Elisha's hands later. Verse 7 says, and it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive? This man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider it, see how he seeks to quarrel with me. So it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So first of all, we see that Naaman was in need, that he was desperate for a cure. And then we see why he gets one eventually. Naaman comes to the king of Israel. He provides this letter where the king of Syria basically says, hey, I'm looking at you, Jehoram, king of Israel, for a cure. And Jehoram obviously is upset by this because he can't cure leprosy. Because not really anybody can of their own volition but God. And so he's upset and he tears his clothes and he says, my God, to kill me with a lie, that he sends me this man to heal. Clearly, the king of Syria wants to fight, right? He's sending me his commander of his army. I can't come now. Clearly, there's a conflict here. He's just looking for an excuse to attack us. And so Jehoram is very distressed by this, because he forgot that there's a prophet in Israel. Elisha, sends to the king and says, "Why are you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, and he shall know there's a prophet in Israel." The problem that Jehoram faced, that he was so upset, that he was so distressed, was because that he forgot Elisha was there. He forgot that there was someone who could cure leprosy. If he remembered that Jehoram was out, or that Elisha was out there, and that God was with him, and God could probably do great miracles, that he raised people from the dead, and that he did all these other things, clearly Jehoram would have known that he could just send him down to Elisha and he'd be fine. But he forgot, the king forgot himself, that there was a prophet in Israel. And so when Elisha sends to him and says, send him to me, I'll show him that there's a prophet in Israel, he's also telling Jehoram that he would prove that there's a prophet in Israel. And so this answer is twofold, and the reason for this miracle is twofold. And that Elisha shows the Syrian, the pagan worshiper, the enemy of Israel, that God is with him and working in Israel. But he also shows the very king himself, who was not on the right track of being one of the wicked kings, since all the kings of Israel were wicked before the king of Israel was wicked. Showing this wicked king that there was, in fact, the power of God working in Israel through Elisha. And so we have Naaman in need of a cure. We have the person who's going to cure him and why. And then verses 9 through 19, we have the whole process of his recovery and what happens afterward. Verse 9, then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hands in the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him. And said, my father, the prophet had told you to do something great, and you not have done it. How much more then, when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored, like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him. And he said, indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now, therefore, please take a gift from your servant. But he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So Naaman said, then if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of them, for your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. My master goes to the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant from this thing. And he said to him, go in peace. So he departed from a short distance. And then from there, we have the servant of Elisha come and take advantage of him and through greed, kind of rob him of some of the gifts that he brought. That's not really the point we're going to get to here at all. We have Naaman coming to Elisha, and Elisha sends a messenger out to him. He doesn't come to him himself. He just sends a guy out to him to say, hey, go wash, dip in the Jordan 7 times, and that's all you need to do. That's all you have to do to be healed and to be made clean. I don't think this was him sending a messenger because he was afraid of being contaminated, because he intentionally to disrespect Naaman. I think this was Naaman needing to be humble. He came full of great import with lots of wealth to buy a cure. He came to the king first, and he was this big important guy, and he expected, as we find out, the prophet himself to come out and shout and wave and do some big scene, this big trick to heal him. And he was expecting a big deal to be made because he was that important. But Elisha just another servant and tells him a very, very simple task for him to go and do. Something that doesn't really seem worthy of such a great man, because Naaman had a pride problem. So that's why he's so upset when he's just told dip 7 times in the Jordan. Because he's like, I came all this way. I'm this great guy. I've got this great need. I've come this great distance. And you ask me to do something so small? You ask me to do something that I could do at home, that isn't worthy of this great need that I have? Because he saw himself, and he saw this issue as so important and so valuable that the simple solution he was offered was insufficient in his eyes. And there was a pride working in him to make him see the offer, the solution that God provided as insufficient, because he thought he knew what he needed, or what would be right, what would be the right thing for God to do, rather than what God knew needed to be done. And so he leaves. He storms off. He becomes furious, and he goes away, and he has a conversation kind of to himself. And the servants set him straight. And they say, the prophet had told you to do something great. You not have done it. How much more when he says to you, wash and be clean? He'd come this far. He'd come all this distance, gone all this effort, gone to his enemies for a cure. And he was going to walk away when the solution was right in front of him. He was told what to do, this very basic thing, this simple thing. The trip to the Jordan was probably 30, 40 miles. Not that far when you're in a chariot like he was. Quick trip there, dip 7 times, going home, he's scot-free, he's healed, he's clean. Elisha asked for no payment in return. He could just take the silver and the gold and the clothes that he brought and take them home with him, having lost very little, but a little bit of time to become clean. I mean, he's going to walk away and leave it all behind because it wasn't good enough. And so his servants say, look, you came this far, and if he'd asked you to do something great, to kill somebody, to bring him, pay him a bunch of gold or silver, you would have done it. You were desperate, but you're going to walk away and leave behind a very simple solution, because the solution was easier than he thought. And so obviously that kind of makes him see the light. He goes down, he dips himself, he's become clean. It said his flesh was restored with the flesh of a little child, he was clean. And so he returns to Elisha, and he says, take a gift. I have all this stuff with me to pay, take it. And Elisha refuses. And I think there's several reasons for this. Partially maybe to show that this was not something that Elisha did for selfish gain. This was the work of God. Maybe the reason that Elisha didn't come out and wave his hand and make a big scene was to show that it was God working and not himself doing some sort of magic or witchcraft. But it was the power of God working over a distance to heal him. But he refuses his gift, and so instead Naaman says, well, give me some soil, which seems good. He says, let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. Instead of me giving you this gift, give me some dirt. Why would he ask this? That's an odd thing to ask as a commander of an army, as a great powerful man. The reason I think for this is because the thought process Naaman has was, if you give me some dirt, I can put it on the ground in my country and I'll sanctify it so that I can offer sacrifices on it, the same as if I was worshiping God in his land. Because what he swears, what he promises, is to serve the Lord God alone, and only him and no other gods. And then we go to where we started this lesson from, verse 18, when he says, yet this thing that the Lord pardon your servant. When your master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he hands on my hand, and bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant from this thing. First, Naaman came with the expectation of what God was going to do from him and the way he's going to do it. And he had this image in his mind that what he would give to God, or the prophet, or whoever healed him, would be this money and these changes of clothing. And so then his expectations are subverted in that the action is not what he expected. It's some small, simple thing. And then the payment that he tries to give, the terms he tries to make, are refused. And then when he says, okay, well then instead I'll worship God alone, he tries to make this provision for himself. To worship God, but also bow down in the temple of some pagan deity. And we're not sure, we're not told whether Elisha said, that's absurd, it doesn't work. We're just told that he says, go in peace. And so maybe that was an agreement that was worked out. But Naaman came with this image in his mind of what God could do for him. And if he was going to do anything in return, that this is how he was going to do it. And so we see ourselves in Naaman because we do the same things. And we make the same mistakes, we have the same thought processes. And we see ourselves in this and the way that he's refused. Because we too need a cure. Sometimes we have trouble. Sometimes we struggle with sin and we have wickedness in our lives that separates us from God. The sickness that we often liken the sin to. We have this infection in us that will ultimately kill us. And sometimes we just have straight-to-day struggles and difficulties, death of family members, and loss, and various sufferings that we go through as human beings. And we need a cure. We're desperate. We're looking for something. And if we come to God, we approach God, thinking that he's going to solve it outright. We're going to pray to God. We're going to say, hey, take this temptation away from me. And it's never that simple. And God, says, okay, not directly, but he comes to us and we see in his word things that we can do to solve our problem and make us better. And sometimes we say, well, I don't want to do that because it's not big enough. How can it be that easy? This isn't the way to solve it. I know what's right. And we don't trust the one who we approached with our problem in the first place. And so we fail to be cleaned because we do not see the simple things we have to do. I think if God would appear to each of us in a vision tonight as we were sleeping, clear as day, and say, hey, I need you and your family to move to California and do some mission work out here for me. Or I need you to leave your job and go somewhere else because I have plans for you there. Or I'm going to, you have this struggle in your life, and I'm going to take this temptation away from you if you give double your contribution to the church weekly, or some great thing. I think we would all agree that if we were approached with a very simple, clear-cut, do this great thing and you'll get this in return, then we would do it. But when it comes to living day by day as the people of God, exercising self-control in the little things and avoiding temptations ourselves, or putting ourselves in situations that don't have that, when we choose not in the little things of the everyday life that God lays out as this is what you should do, the simple things every day. When we don't do that, because we see that our way is better, we do not take the terms that God offers, and so we try to come to God on our own terms. One simple thing, I think the biggest takeaway tonight, if you hear nothing else from this sermon, is that living for God is not dying once as a martyr. People have done it, many of the apostles were killed, but their living for God was not when Peter got crucified, perhaps upside down. It was not being beheaded as John was, or others were. It's not the great, simple, singular acts. That's not living for God. Living for God is waking up every single day, determined to be His person. In the simple things of life, in your daily conversations, in your daily thoughts, the things that you do, the places you go. Living for God is daily, it is small, it is simple. Living for God is simple as dipping 7 times in the river that's just an hour or 2 away. Living for God is not the thousands of shekels of silver and gold. It's not the changes of clothing. It's not our terms. It's not what we think it is. It's not great deeds necessarily. But it's simple, daily stuff that God asks from us every day. And the parallel tonight is clear between us and Naaman. In that we often make his mistakes. But to be clean, he needed cleaning, right? He had this illness, he had this disease that he needed removed from him. And he looked to be cleansed. And all God asked from him was to dip in the water, right? And so we can see in ourselves the same offer. When we need cleansing from sin, when we need to be made clean because the weight and the stain of sin is upon us, and our own wrongdoing weighs us down, all God asks from us is a dip in the water. And if He asks us to do something great, will we not do it? How much more so when He says, wash and be clean? If you need to be baptized, or need to change your way of thinking about how you live for God every day, we ask that you do so tonight, right now, as we come, as we stand, as we sing.